Vytautas was no pagan zealot, but he knew an opportunity when he saw one. Back in Lithuania, he was building an alliance of noblemen who would rather have him as duke than Jogaila, and people were flocking to him.
Today we will dive into Duel of the Dukes, which is about the civil war in Lithuania between Jogaila and Vytautas. We will also look at how you can take your first rough campaign draft and turn it into a complete outline. Welcome to Making Jadwiga. Once you've picked your protagonist and plotted out a rough draft for the individual scenarios, there is one last step that you can take before you start designing, which will make your job a lot easier later on, and that is to create a proper outline. I'm going to show you two methods of outlining, each with their pros and cons. Let's start with the first method, which I will call the mise en place method. And no, that's not a technical term, I just want to make sure they can be easily distinguished. In cooking, mise en place refers to the preparations you do before you start cooking, clearing your workspace, taking out your equipment, and preparing all the ingredients. Basically, you make sure that everything is in place and ready to be used. You can write your outline in a similar way, by breaking down the scenario into its constituent parts. You write a summary of the gameplay and a list of the players, with details like their civilization, starting age, and their role in the scenario. After this, you write up a list of objectives, another list of dialogues and what will trigger them, and bullet points with important events that can be activated while playing, such as the arrival of the Muscovite army in this scenario, which occurs when the player has captured 4 of the towns on the map. It's also very helpful to draw some sort of sketch of how you want the map to look like. This sketch can be extremely simple or very detailed, and include anything from mountains, rivers and forests, to likely routes of attack, important choke points, the location of certain objectives, and major resource deposits. You don't have to follow this outline to the letter when you're actually designing, but it can be a good starting point, and it will help you keep things organized. This method is a very deconstructed way of looking at the scenario, but it can definitely make the design process a lot more efficient. It gives you an overview of the entire campaign, allowing you to trim away excess dialogue, events and objectives, even before you open the editor. This can also be a good way to work if you're working as a team, as it gives other people an easy way to get a grip of the scenario. The downside of this approach is that it doesn't really give you a sense of how the scenario will feel when you're playing it. That's why I like to use what I will simply call the screenplay method. In this method, you write your scenario from start to finish as a screenplay, the way you would a script for a film or TV series. Each part of the scenario becomes a scene, with its own setting, directions and dialogue. This method is especially helpful in RPG or fixed force scenarios, where you move from point A to point B while not necessarily having an economy, but it can also help in pure build and destroy scenarios, as a way of visualizing how the scenario will be experienced by the player. To give you an example of how this looks in practice, let's take a look at the script for The Matter of the Crown, which begins with a fixed force mission. We start with the title. Ext stands for exterior, while int would stand for interior. This is not too relevant in official campaigns, but in my custom scenarios I often create indoor scenes, and in such cases it can definitely be useful. Then there is the location and a short description of the scene and what will happen in it, which helps you visualize how the scene should look. Next is a dialogue exchange between Jadwiga and her bodyguard, which in practice was shortened to a single line. And these descriptions and dialogues continue on throughout the entire scenario, and this allows you to experience the gameplay in a way before you even open the editor. For an official campaign, these scripts are usually pretty short. The longest in Jadwiga were 14 pages long, and that's before I started cutting dialogues. Almost half of that consists of player descriptions, hints, scouts and so on, so in practice you might have 6 or 7 pages of actual scene descriptions and dialogue. In custom scenarios on the other hand, I can easily get up to 30 pages or more per scenario when I have a detailed story, which I usually do. You can experiment with these two concepts and see what works best for you. Or if you're just designing for fun, like a normal person, you can skip this step entirely. I will say though that outlining helps even if you're designing just for fun, as it makes it easier to actually finish things and not just start them. And I should know, I've started far more scenarios than I have ever finished, and the ones I have finished have almost always had some sort of outline. Duel of the Dukes is inspired by the many Risk-style custom scenarios out there, such as Risk 100 Years War. In other words, it's Age of Empires 2 meets a board game. I had never designed a scenario like this before, and when I wanted to take a creative approach to portraying a civil war, turning it into a Risk scenario seemed like the best option. Many Risk scenarios use unique trigger mechanics that allow you to create units simply by selecting a building. In an effort both to save time and hundreds of triggers, as well as to create a more streamlined gaming experience, I decided to go with a simplified version. You still produce units like you would in a regular game, but the town control mechanic is strictly trigger controlled, and your economy largely consists of tributes and rewards for capturing enemy towns. This is also the only winter map in the Jadwiga campaign. I rarely design winter landscapes, as I find that it is a constant challenge not to fill them with green bushes and eye candy and really anything that will break up the snowy monotony. For a winter map to look realistic, there should be large expanses of nothing but snow, and finding the balance between too much and too little eye candy is very tricky, at least for me. But I think I managed to create a pretty nice map for this in the end. What this scenario lacks is towns or other settlements that have a clear personality, and that's intentional. The towns were supposed to be more utilitarian than anything, so the design became more functional and less decorative. That's not a bad thing, but it's definitely not my favorite thing to design. There's only so much you can do when you're essentially limited to nothing but a castle, 2 to 4 military buildings and some walls. However, I did try to imbue the landscape with something of a personality. In between the rather nondescript towns are frozen swamps, rugged mountains and rocky cliffsides. Even when a map needs to put function first, always make sure to put some beauty in there as well, wherever you can find a pocket for it. The greatest challenge with this scenario was to create an AI opponent that had a strategy of its own when choosing its starting towns. At first I wanted to create a unique response for every choice the player could possibly make, but I quickly realized that this would be a behemoth of a task and require hundreds of triggers for no real reward. So instead I went for a simpler system that achieved largely the same effect. Vytautas has a priority list, which he goes through whenever it's his turn to choose. He will try to pick towns that produce cavalry. Failing that, he goes for archer towns, and as a last resort, infantry towns. That does mean that he sometimes mirrors your choices, but it's still a way to add a lot of variety in how the board can look at the start, while only requiring a relatively simple trigger system. When it comes to the script for this scenario, you will see almost no cuts at all when you compare it to the final product. Originally, the Teutons were supposed to bring mercenaries in the form of longbowmen and custiers, but in the end that was dropped. I also had to cut some of the responses for when you lose or take control of a town, but that's about it really. Because the scenario focuses so much on a single gameplay mechanic, there just wasn't much that needed streamlining. And this is probably the scenario that most closely resembles the original script. Duel of the Dukes takes a, at least for an official campaign, unique approach to portraying a war between two rival factions, and with it ends the comparatively small-scale first half of the campaign. Next time, we will move on to the Siege of Vilnius, a scenario which I for a long time considered scrapping entirely, but which turned out to be one of my favorites from the entire campaign.